The long month is over. Kind of. Because chapter 262 of JJK came out, but chapter 262 of JJK was already out, but now we have the rest of chapter 262. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. After the month-long hiatus that was supposed to be a 3-week-long hiatus and then got continued into being a month-long hiatus, we have now gotten the continuation of chapter 262. Because for those of you who haven't had your brain entirely rotted by the last month of Lobotomy Kaizen, you'll remember that the chapter 262 that we got a month ago was only 7 pages long. And thus, the chapter 262 that we're currently getting is 12 pages long to complement the other 7 pages. So did we get a new chapter of JJK? I mean, kind of. But after this week, we're back to weekly installments of JJK because Gege is feeling better, so we really don't have all that much to complain about. Now, for those of you who didn't know this chapter was only 12 pages long, you're probably going, oh, not that much can happen in only 12 pages. And I guess to a certain degree, you are right. Not a huge amount happens in chapter 262.2, but the fight between Gota and Sukuna does continue. And while things still aren't going super well for Gota, they might be taking a turn for the better. On top of that, we got a couple of key points of exposition that have helped us understand how Gota's body operates. That is to say, we now better understand how his techniques work, what he has access to, and what might happen after those 5 minutes of the copy technique are up. On top of that, we now understand what Gota's endgame is and how close that endgame truly might be. So while 12 pages isn't a whole lot of content, there's certainly enough to talk about, which is why today we're talking chapter 262.2 of JJK Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me keeping you up to date with all things anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And happy America's birthday. It's not America's birthday when you're watching this, but it's America's birthday when I'm filming this. No holidays on this team. I was just in Hawaii for 4 days. I'm always on vacation. So, chapter 262 picks up where chapter 262 left off, and that is with a fully manifested Rika holding on to Yuta's corpse, crying her multiple eye slits out. Like, we know Rika has one eye. We've seen the one eye, but the tears are coming from everywhere. Anyways, after the continuation of this chapter opens with a full page of Rika holding on to Yuta's corpse and crying, we cut back to what Yuta is truly up to outside of his body, which is controlling Gojo's body and the Frankenstein monster we refer to as Gota. And for those of you who once again had your brains fried by a month-long stint of Lobotomy Kaizen, Gota and Sukuna are currently in a clash of domains that's gonna last 3 minutes. This is because the outside of Unlimited Void is able to withstand the slashing of Malevolent Shrine, which has a greater range than Unlimited Void, for 3 minutes, which means within the capacity of this domain, which is much larger than the basketball that it looks like on the outside, Gota and Sukuna are battling it out against each other in a round of fisticuffs. Well, at least it's a round of fisticuffs for Sukuna, who's only able to use domain amplification because Gota can use the Limitless in Infinity. And thus Sukuna has to amplify his domain in order to punch through Infinity. And since he has to amplify his domain, that means he can't use his innate technique, like Cleave, Dismantle, or the Fire Arrow. However, technically Sukuna wouldn't be able to use the Fire Arrow anyways because he made a binding vow a couple of chapters ago saying that he can only ever use his Fire Arrow when his domain is open and he's outnumbered. And thus if he was to use his Fire Arrow in the battle against Gota, he'd be breaking his own binding vow, which he's like played with a bunch of times, so who knows, maybe he will. The only punishment for breaking a binding vow you make with yourself is the loss of the things gained by the binding vow. They are very low stakes when you're making them with yourself. And thus in the first page of the continuation of this chapter, we see Gota ducking one of Sukuna's punches and throwing him over onto his back, with the editor's note saying, amplification versus infinity, the battle rages for 3 minutes. Now it's important to note here that Gota has a massive, and I mean massive, advantage in this battle. While Gota might technically have a 5-minute timer until he possibly becomes a corpse again, a 5-minute timer doesn't mean anything when there's already a 3-minute timer on how long your domain is going to last. Tie that into the fact that Gota is able to use innate techniques like red, blue, and purple, while Sukuna is only able to use domain amplification and possibly the world-cutting slash, but Sukuna can't use the world-cutting slash because he doesn't have 2 hands on opposite sides of his body, which means that Sukuna's only option is fisticuffs, and only with one side of his body. Mind you, he is also still manually pumping his own heart. If ever there was a scenario that was set up for Gota to be victorious, this is the one. And yet, doesn't appear to be going that way. See, because after Gota throws Sukuna onto his back, he kicks him across the ground, though Sukuna is able to block this kick. It's at this point that we get a big exposition dump from Gota, where he confirms that Rika isn't haunting this body, which is pretty clearly and obviously shown to us earlier on in this very same chapter. But that's kind of interesting. See, because including 2 full pages of a fully manifested Rika holding onto Yuta's corpse led the majority of the fandom to come to a myriad of different conclusions. See, the inclusion of a fully manifested Rika holding onto Yuta's corpse made a lot of people theorize that maybe Rika would be able to join the battle against Sukuna of her own accord. I mean, now that she's technically haunting a body that's no longer alive and she's still fully manifested, that must mean that Rika's now her own cursed spirit, which means she can act of her own free will. And since Sukuna was technically the person who killed Yuta, then Rika would obviously have a fair amount of gripe with Sukuna. And while it still is absolutely a possibility, it now seems like the real reason we were shown a fully manifested Rika holding onto Yuta's corpse was to hammer home the fact that Rika is not haunting Gota's body, and therefore the abilities that Rika brought to Yuta's body are not accessible to Gota. And while we could have just been told this, like we are currently being told this, one, that wouldn't have made for such a good cliffhanger at the end of 262.1, and 2, physical evidence you can get your eyes on is always better. But yeah, like I said, after Gota makes the realization that Rika is not haunting this body, Gota comes to the realization that he can't use any techniques outside of the Limitless. And this includes Kenjaku's techniques, which means that Yuta, after switching into Gojo's body, now can only use Gojo's techniques. But if Yuta can only use Gojo's techniques, that means he's unable to switch back to his own body. Maybe. Maybe. It's worded ambiguously. See, technically what Gota says is looks like using Kenjaku's techniques simultaneously is a no-go. Now, this could mean either one of 2 things. Either it means that after switching into Gojo's body, that Yuta no longer has access to Kenjaku's cursed techniques, or it means that he's unable to use Kenjaku and Gojo's techniques simultaneously. Now, I'd reckon that the second possibility is the more likely of those 2 scenarios because of how Yuta's copy technique works, which only allows him to use one copy technique at a time. But at the same time here, we're so far out of the depth of our understanding of Yuta, Kenjaku, and Gojo's techniques because Yuta used copy to use Kenjaku's brain swapping ability to switch into Gojo's body. And technically, if Yuta was still using Kenjaku's cursed techniques, he should be able to use all of Kenjaku's cursed techniques simultaneously because Kenjaku was able to use all of the cursed techniques of his previous incarnations and the cursed technique of the body he was currently inhabiting simultaneously, something that Yuta is currently unable to do in Gojo's body. But at the same time, consuming Kenjaku might not have given Yuta all of Kenjaku's cursed techniques, just his innate technique, which was the body swapping technique, which would mean that Yuta didn't inherit cursed techniques like Yuji's mom's gravity curse technique or Geto's cursed spirit manipulation technique. And if we go with that line of thinking, then technically, yes, Yuta should be able to use the brain swapping technique to switch back into his own body. Maybe. However, in the context of how we're understanding this information dump, that means he would have to deactivate things like the 6 eyes and the Limitless to do so. Anyways, after that exposition dump, Gota goes on to say Sukuna shouldn't be able to use the world-cutting slash with his left arms gone. And is that true? Actually, I've gone back and it is true. Because so far as I could remember in chapter 251, Sukuna had one of his hands cut off. And he did have one of his hands cut off. But then later in that very same chapter, he uses world cutting slash to cut Yuta in half. And so I was like, well, if he lost one of his hands, it surely had to be his other left hand, so he couldn't have used world cutting slash against Yuta. But no, he lost one of his left hands, but not both of them. So when he uses the world cutting slash against Yuta after Yuji fails to reach out to Megami, he has a left hand. So yes, Yuta is correct when he says that Sukuna is currently unable to use the world-cutting slash, which leads Go to the realization that outside of domain amplification, Sukuna shouldn't have any more tricks up his sleeve. But boy oh boy, can I almost guarantee you that he does. Also, Sukuna doesn't wear sleeves. Now, this sudden and powerful realization that Sukuna has nothing up his non-existent sleeves that should be able to bypass infinity outside of domain amplification leads Goto to the clear and obvious conclusion that he has the advantage, all while slapping Sukuna's face down with an open palm strike. However, when Goto goes to follow up with a barrage of punches, he misses because he misjudged how far away Sukuna was, which leads to Sukuna launching a counterattack against Goto. And what's really interesting about this fight is that throughout the entirety of Gojo versus Sukuna Part 1, Gojo never made any of the faces that Gota is currently making. There is clear and obvious distress on Gota's face, which is really weird to see because it is just Gojo's face, but seeing clear and obvious distress on Gojo's face is a new and weird experience. Now, Yuta continues on by saying, I had the same thought during switch training, that Gojo's arms are insanely long. And this is a reasonable conclusion for Yuta to come to because Gojo is insanely tall for a Japanese person, and Yuta just isn't. But this isn't the only problem that Yuta's having. So Yuta's also having problems with the Limitless. So Yuta goes on to say that from the outside, the Limitless technique seems flawless and all-powerful. However, now that Yuta's trying to use it inside of Gojo's body, he realizes just how sensitive it is, which leads Yuta to come to the conclusion that there was no way that a single round of switch training was enough for him to master the Limitless. And he's having all these thoughts while guarding from a barrage of kicks and punch from Sukuna that knock him back. And at the end of these thoughts, he goes to fire either a blue or a red. However, nothing happens, which leads Sukuna to come to the conclusion that Gota has misfired. At which point Gota says, I get why you need the 6 eyes to use this technique. And I find this line of dialogue incredibly interesting because, as has been said many times already, one of the most important takeaways from the existence of Gota is the conversation revolving around the question that Geto asked Gojo. Are you the strongest because you're Gojo, or are you Gojo because you're the strongest? Basically asking one of the most important questions in all anime fandoms: are you hardworking, or are you talented? And as we see Yuta struggle to control Gojo's body and realize how finicky the Limitless is, we begin to slowly but surely appreciate that Gojo wasn't just talented, but also incredibly hardworking. Here's the thing. We've always known that was the situation. See, Gojo's entire track record has always proven the fact that he's hardworking. And while he was born with some talents, Gojo had to be put in multiple, very precarious situations to access the entirety of that latent talent. See, Gojo didn't even technically master Infinity until the end of the Hidden Inventory arc, where after almost being killed by Toji, he created a way to automate the Limitless to run as a 6 eyes function, where Infinity would constantly be run around Gojo and would stop things that he assessed as threats, while allowing things that he didn't see as threats to touch him. However, none of this was possible without Gojo's awakening, which allowed him to learn RCT. Because in order to run Infinity constantly, he would need to use the 6 eyes constantly, which is a massive strain on his brain, which he would need to heal with RCT. But figuring out the automation and creating a computational model that would allow for the Infinity and 6 eyes to work collaboratively constantly was a massive and strenuous undertaking for Gojo, where we see at the end of the Hidden Inventory arc that he's been trying to figure the method out, having Geto throw erasers at him to see how close he can stop them away from him. And thus the existence of Gota and Yuta trying to control Gojo's body, which seemed to be easy for Gojo, confirms to us that Gojo was as hardworking as he was talented, because hopping into Gojo's body hasn't provided an instant win for Yuta. And this chapter has laid it out to us that even if it was to provide a win to Yuta, it wouldn't be a win without conditions. It's at this point that Yuta begins to reflect on a conversation he had with Gojo, where Gojo says, it'll be fine, I'm the strongest after all, which leads Yuta to think, how insanely powerful were you to say that so confidently? Now, Sukuna, who believes that Gota just misfired on a red or a blue, thinks to himself he has no idea how to control such a troublesome technique. He then says out loud to Gota, you think you have time to daydream, and lands an uppercut against Gota's guarded arms, knocking him back. Now, to this point that we get a big exposition dump from Sukuna, as we get a peek into what he does and does not know. Now, Sukuna goes on to say that Kenjaku told me that Akotsu's technique is copy. Kenjaku also told Sukuna that in order for Yuta to copy a technique, he likely has to feed part of somebody to Rika, whether that either be their whole body or a part of their body. Sukuna then wonders whether or not Rika came with this new body, and if she didn't, as to whether or not he can use his other copy techniques. Sukuna then answers his own question and says, even if he can use his copy techniques, since I've already battled against Yuta in his domain, I've got a pretty good grasp on what's in his arsenal. Sukuna then continues by saying, at this point, the Limitless is just a side effect of Kenjaku's technique, meaning that Sukuna's come to the rather apt conclusion that Gota isn't able to use any techniques outside of the Limitless, or at least the relationship that Gota has with the Limitless is comparable to the relationship that Kenjaku had with Geto's cursed techniques. Sukuna continues on by saying, I confirmed in the battle against him in his own domain that he can't use the copy techniques simultaneously, because for those of you who don't remember, True Mutual Love, Yuta's domain expansion, allows him to not only apply a guaranteed hit innate technique to the barrier, but also allows him to use all of the copy curse techniques he has by picking up katanas that are skewed around the entire domain. But he can only use one of these katanas at a time, which confirmed to Sukuna he can only use one of his copied techniques at a time, which brings Sukuna to a very similar conclusion that Gota came to earlier in this battle, which is currently he has no other cards outside of the Limitless, which leads Sukuna to begin asking the real important questions. How long can he use these copied techniques? Will he be able to maintain this form after he's done copying Kenjaku's curse technique? And the most important question, What would he do if he came into this battle assuming there was no way back? In that case, the move he might make, and it's at this point that Sukuna trails off, thinking about the time that Gojo exploded half of Shinjuku with a hollow purple. And thus Sukuna has come to the realization that Yuta has entered this battle with no intent of ever returning to his own body, and thus the surest fire way to defeat Sukuna or injure him to the point where Yuji and Todo would be able to finish him off would be a hollow purple that devastates the entirety of the inside of their domain clash. Now, while ironically Sukuna is now daydreaming, we see that Gota is slowly but surely pouring through every single one of Gojo's memories, which confirms to us how Kenjaku's body swapping technique works. See, a month ago when I was breaking down chapter 262.1, I talked about how it was absurd that Yuta didn't know that Sukuna was able to amplify his domain within a domain expansion because Gojo's body had already seen him do that. Now, some people pointed out that there's a possibility that there's no way that Yuta would be able to understand all of Gojo's memories instantaneously. Now, I figured since Gojo's domain expansion is literally unlimited void, which accesses all of the information the universe has to offer, that if there's anybody's brain you'd be able to settle into quickly and download all the information, it would be his. But apparently, either Yuta's not all that talented at Kenjaku's curse technique, or Gojo's got a lot more brain than most people, because while Sukuna's off daydreaming, Yuta is individually flickering through Gojo's memories, trying to learn as much about Gojo's body memories and fighting technique as possible so that it can be as powerful as possible. And thus, this is why Yuta didn't know that Sukuna was able to amplify his domain inside a domain expansion, because he doesn't know all of Gojo's memories yet. And thus the memory that Yuta's currently accessing is Gojo telling him that his cursed energy output is sloppy as hell. To which Gojo follows up by saying, hasn't Kusakabe said anything about that yet? What's weird about this memory though is that Gojo's eyes aren't covered. And not only are his eyes not covered, he also doesn't have his eye wraps or his sunglasses even on him. And for those of you who think, oh, maybe this is when Gojo and Yuta switched bodies, it's not, because we see Maki, Panda, and Inamaki, and Maki isn't covered in any scars, and Inamaki has 2 arms. So this is from like chapter 0 era. But anyways, it's revealed in the following panels that the reason that Yuta's pouring through every single one of Gojo's memories one by one is to try and figure out the one thing that Sukuna was afraid of: hollow purple. So it's at this point that Gota begins to make the hand signs and say the chant for hollow purple, which is 9 points, polarized light, but that's as far as Gota makes it, because Sukuna's heard those words before and he's not gonna hear them again. So Sukuna rushes in, slaps down Gota's hand-signed hand with one of his nubs, and lands a right hook to Gota's face. Sukuna then thinks to himself, does he not understand why Gojo was forced to fire off hollow purple in such a roundabout way? He then continues his thoughts by saying, I won't give him a singular opening to use that move. Now, essentially what Sukuna is saying here is that Gojo was forced to use hollow purple in this incredibly circuitous way because of how powerful it was. See, if Gojo was just able to go hollow purple, it wouldn't be that powerful, because risk makes curse techniques stronger, and thus having to make hand signs and use chants always makes a technique stronger. This is why the world cutting slash and hollow purple operate in this fashion. And these aren't the only techniques that operate in this fashion. Utahime's solo forbidden area also operates like this. And thus, after his failed attempt to use hollow purple, Gota is thrown into the malevolent shrine. You know, like the actual shrine part with all the cow skulls. Now, while being thrown into all these incredibly sharp and pointy and brittle cow skulls, Gota comes to the realization that Sukuna may still be wary of me using other copied techniques. But Sukuna should also know that I can't use 2 copied techniques at once. And therefore, since Gota knows that Sukuna knows that Gota can't use 2 copied techniques at once, that Sukuna's defense will be down for anything that's not a limitless base technique. Which is why Yuta says this simple plan based within unlimited void, which is Gojo's domain expansion, will work. But what's that plan, you ask? Well, it's got to do with the voice recorder. So you remember earlier when Gota misfired, or at least Sukuna believed he misfired? He didn't actually misfire. Kind of like how Gojo was able to collide his red and his blue to create his final purple, Gota at this moment fired off a blue, but a blue in the distance that Sukuna did not see. Now, little did Sukuna know that that blue was fired for one goal and one goal alone, and that was to grab a tape recorder. A tape recorder that only had 2 words on it: don't move. And as the blue had drawn the tape recorder right next to Sukuna's face, those words, uttered by none other than Inamaki, forced Sukuna to stand still. Now, this isn't good for Inumaki, because as we know, the severity of what Inumaki forces somebody to do has a proportional effect on his vocal cords. And while saying don't move isn't necessarily a serious thing to say to somebody, because Inumaki is saying this to Sukuna and therefore forcing Sukuna to stay still, it appears as though Inumaki's vocal cords have been destroyed. At least if I was Gege, I would destroy them. Because Inumaki is shown like Itachi at the end of his life, grasping onto his neck, spitting out blood. And while we've definitely seen Inumaki's vocal cords struggle in the past, this appears to be one of the deadliest blows they've ever been struck. However, it appears to be worth it. See, because as Sukuna hears these words uttered into a tape recorder by Inumaki and played by the Blue, apparently, Sukuna comes to the realization that this technique being used is not a copy, but the real thing. Now, this is interesting for like a myriad of reasons. One, how was the tape recorder played? And two, did Inumaki incur this penalty when he recorded it into the tape recorder or only after it was played? And while obviously we know that cursed techniques and cursed energy can be imbued into items, can you use this method multiple times and just slowly but surely kill Inumaki? Or is all the cursed energy poured out in the one time? See, because this isn't technically the first time we've seen cursed speech used with technology, but the other time was Yuta using cursed speech over a megaphone, which kind of makes more sense for cursed speech than a recording that's going to be played at a later date. But anyways, those are the kind of details that only I would focus on, because in this moment when Sukuna stood completely frozen by possibly Inumaki's last cursed speech, Gota finally has the time to do the full hollow purple incantation, which is 9 points, polarized light, crow and shomyo, the gap between within and without. Hollow purple. And that is how the chapter ends, with Gota warming up a hollow purple to fire at the now frozen Sukuna. Will this be the end of Sukuna? Will this be the final move ever used against him? No. God, no. I wish I could say yes, but no. And if you believe it is, then you're just not paying attention. Even outside of the context of the Sukuna cycle, and the fact that Gota's now hit his 2-chapter barrier, which means in the next chapter he's gonna be defeated, thus restarting the Sukuna cycle so Yuji can step back in the battle against Sukuna. The entire subcontext between this battle between Gota and Sukuna is that Gota is struggling to reach Gojo's level of power. Because Gojo wasn't the strongest because he was Gojo because he was the strongest. And thus, if Gota were to step in and fire off a hollow purple that was strong enough that it finally killed Sukuna, that would mean that Gota was in some way or another either as strong or stronger than Gojo, which would fly in the face of all of the subcontext of this fight. Like Yuta saying that I didn't realize how finicky the Limitless was, and how powerful must have Gojo been to say with confidence that he was truly the strongest. And thus, if Gota's hollow purple is the one that finishes off Sukuna, that's kind of a problem when you consider the fact that Gojo hit Sukuna with a 120% hollow purple, and then his final hollow purple, and Sukuna survived both of them. And thus, if this one kills Sukuna, even though Sukuna is in a very weakened state, that devalidifies Gojo basically as a character. And the more I'm talking about it, I'm realizing that Gege hates Gojo, so maybe that is where we're hurtling towards. But no, even though Gege does hate Gojo, everything about Gojo's path up until this point has proven the fact that he's hardworking, especially when you consider the fact that Geto posed that question to it. See, by Geto, in a very pivotal moment, asking Gojo whether or not he's the strongest because he's Gojo, or if he's Gojo because he's the strongest, creates the conversation point in the fandom around that talking point. And we are, as a fandom, supposed to use the body of evidence provided to us by Gege to come to the realization that Gojo was, in fact, incredibly hardworking, though confident. And it's his confidence in how easy he made things look that made people believe that he was only just talented. So what do I believe is going to happen in chapter 263? Well, it's one of two things. Either this time around, Gota is actually going to misfire, and the hollow purple either isn't going to come out or is going to come out in a massively diminished state, which would once and for all solidify the fact that Gojo was truly hardworking, and while a genius, had to fight for every single ounce of power he ever had. Or Gota is going to fire off a hollow purple, and while that hollow purple will hit Sukuna, Sukuna will be able to do something like amplify his domain or make a binding vow that will allow for him to survive through that hollow purple. However, in the second scenario, assuming that after the hollow purple is fired, the 3 minutes aren't up, this will constitute Sukuna taking enough damage that Unlimited Void is able to hit him him even for a limited amount of time. And whether that time is 1 second, 10 seconds, or a full minute, any amount of unlimited void is going to put Sukuna in a trance-like state after the domain clash is over. And thus, while the Hollow Purple itself wouldn't deal the killing blow, the unlimited void that would win the domain clash when Malevolent Shrine inevitably fell after Sukuna took damage would put Sukuna in a state where Yuji and Todo could possibly finish him off. Because here's the thing, there's technically nothing wrong with Gota helping in the battle against Sukuna. In fact, I believe that a complete and total failure on the behalf of Gota in this battle against Sukuna is not only less likely, but is also technically a worse written ending than Gota helping Yuji and Todo finally beat Sukuna. One, because if Gota isn't the person to defeat Sukuna, it solidifies the fact that Gojo was stronger than Gota. Two, it allows for Yuta to assume the monster role that was thrust upon Gojo. Three, it would most likely lead to Yuta's death. Four, the battle against Sukuna has always been a collaborative effort. And five, it would leave the door open for Yuji being the person to finish off Sukuna, a privilege he didn't get in the battle against Mahito. So while technically I do believe it is slightly more likely that we'll see a diminished Hollow Purple that leads to the Clash of Domains swinging in Gota's favor, I do also still think there's a fairly large possibility that Gota just misfires on the Hollow Purple, because that would be a bow on the conversation that Gojo and Geto had. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. What do you believe we're going to be seeing in Chapter 263? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now I gotta go read MHA's chapter.